Hello, so in this video, I have been seeing these sourdough starters that say you could have your sourdough active and ready to bake within a week. So I wanted to order one and try it out to see how reliable it is. I have not done the baking yet as I'm editing this. It's on day 5 currently. So I'm gonna give it a full week. I might wait until day 8 and then bake with it, and I'll do a video on that as well. So make sure to stay tuned so you can follow along. But as of day 5, it is doing well. In this video, I'm going to try to timestamp it by day. So for the first 3 feedings, you're going to do it every 12 hours. I guess technically not 3. So for the next 2 feedings, you'll do it every 12 hours. So there'll be 1 feeding tonight and then 1 feeding tomorrow morning. And then after that, it will be every 24 hours, which is your typical feeding time frame. I will also be answering some commonly asked questions about sourdough in this as well, kind of as I'm mixing, because if you've worked with sourdough before, you know that there's a lot of mixing when you're doing your sourdough starter to make sure all that flour is incorporated. So a lot of the video you'll see me mixing, but I'm also going to try to fill up some of that time with answering questions. And if you have any questions, make sure to leave them in the comment section below so I can answer them, or someone else can answer them if they get to it before I do. But it's a community. I feel like sourdough is, I want to say, over complicated. Sourdough is not very hard. It's pretty easy for the most part. You can't really go wrong. There's a few simple steps to follow, but it is not set in stone. You can kind of play around with it. Sourdough is forgiving, and it's not as strict as everyone makes it out to be. In this clip, you'll see this is my nightly feeding. The first feeding was a very small amount, and for my particular sourdough, I can link it in the description below, but it only required, I believe, a tablespoon or maybe 2 tablespoons of water and flour for the first feeding, and then the second feeding, I believe, was 1/4 of a cup. The main thing that you want to make sure, and I actually had to adjust mine just slightly, adding a little bit more flour, a little bit more water as needed. You want a thick pancake consistency once it's mixed up. The first feeding that I did, it was a lot thicker than a pancake consistency, but I just did that kind of just to get that starter, I guess kind of a kickstart, I would say. But that's kind of the consistency you're looking for, is a thicker than pancake consistency. So, and you'll see, it's kind of hard to see at this angle, but at day 2, I was already starting to notice some bubbles on the top, which if you're doing sourdough starter without adding any starter in and you're just doing flour, water, starting from a base, you will get bubbles for a little bit. So it was kind of cool to see bubbles on day 2, not even necessarily day 2, but to see bubbles forming that quickly. Throughout the video, you'll see the bubbles do start to intensify. As of day 5, I believe at about 6 hours is when it hit its peak. That's kind of on the, I guess, slower side of what I like. Typically, I like it to be within 4 to 6 hours. You want it to double in size, and then it should typically start to fall. If it grows even higher, that's great. But you want to at least see double in your size. You're going to want it to be very bubbly and airy, and then it's going to have a tangy smell, I guess would be the best way to describe it. It's not going to smell very strong or very moldy. It's just going to have a tang to it. It shouldn't be very strong, and you should not see any color in your sourdough. A big color indicator that you need to trash and like clean out your jars would be if it is any pink color. Sometimes if you leave your sourdough for too long, let's say in the fridge, it will get what's called a hooch on the top, and it's almost like a gray liquid. Me personally, if it has the hooch on the side, I will dump most of that out before incorporating it back into my sourdough. I know it's controversial. Some people will put it back into their sourdough, just mix it right back in. I like to dump most of that out. If I don't get it all out and some of it gets back into the starter, it's not the end of the world. But for me personally, I just don't like to have it in my sourdough starter because I feel like it does give it more of a strong taste. And another thing, when you have your sourdough in the fridge, this is something I usually, if I'm in my off seasons and I'm not baking with it often, I put it in my fridge, take it out, and I'll feed it weekly. When you are wanting to bake with it, I would feed it a couple times before, when you take it out of the fridge, before using it, just so you get your starter active and strong again. When it goes in the fridge, it goes dormant. So when you bring it out and bring it to room temperature, after a couple feeds, it will get strong and start building again. The main thing is you want it to be doubling within that 4 to 6 hour time frame, and you want the bubbles to be very strong, and that's how you know that your starter is ready to bake. Here on day 3, you can see there's a lot of bubbles starting to form at the top. It did not actually, I think it might have gotten to 400, maybe to 500 on this day, but never doubled completely. But it did start rising on day 3, which is a good sign. I was very impressed with buying a sourdough starter off Amazon. I've started mine from flour in the past. I've also got it from a friend in the past too. So being able to get this at your home and be able to start baking, I'm hoping within a week. Stay tuned for that. But hopefully, I mean, that's pretty amazing to be able to get sourdough starter going within a week. And to see this much activity already is pretty cool to me. So I haven't explained it yet, but what I'm doing here is discarding the sourdough starter. This is something you're going to become very familiar with. So with this recipe has it coming out to is you basically have 300 milliliters. And so when you're discarding it, it comes out to about 100 milliliters. They want you to have about half of a cup of sourdough starter, and then you're going to mix in half a cup of flour and half a cup of water with that. So it comes out to about just a little bit over 100 milliliters marks on the jar. So I dump it out on a plate. Sourdough starter should typically not go down your drain. It can clog up your pipes and cause a big issue. So I always dump mine out on a plate. I would not use your sourdough starter or sourdough starter discard until your sourdough is very strong. I know this is something that's also controversial, but you want a strong sourdough starter when you're using a sourdough starter discard for certain recipes. Here on day 4, you can see the sourdough is very bubbly. It actually did start rising up, or doubling up, I should say, but it took about 8 hours for it to double on day 4. The next day it took 6 hours, so I'm very eager to see on day 6 how quickly it rises and if it'll double or more than double. Something, if you notice your sourdough starter is not doubling, you can add in rye or a stronger type of flour, and that will it just kind of gives your starter more nutrients and kind of kickstarts the feed a little bit. I'm not noticing it having an issue rising yet, but that might be something I can do a video on and showing, the difference once the starter is pretty stable to see the versus feeding it regular or adding rye in with the feed, what the difference that makes. Another reason if your sourdough starter is not rising could be the temperature. Sourdough thrives at a higher temperature. I personally keep my house pretty cold in the winter. In the summer, our AC does not keep up, so it gets a little bit warmer in here. So the winter months are really when I notice that I need to keep my sourdough warm. For Christmas this year, I actually asked for a sourdough warmer mat. I hadn't had one before, but you basically put your jar on top of this mat and it kind of keeps it at a good temperature, or after you feed, it'll help kind of keep it at a good temperature so you can bake easier with it. This isn't a necessity. I've done it without it, but it is definitely nice if you want to use your sourdough starter quicker, that you don't have to wait so long. But in saying that, you can just wait a little bit longer. It'll take your sourdough starter longer to rise. It should still be reaching double even if it's at a colder temperature, but it just won't reach that double as quickly. Another question I want to go back to as far as with discard, a lot of people ask if they have to discard their sourdough, and you don't necessarily have to discard it, but when you're feeding, the ratio that you do it, right now we're doing 1 to 1 to 1 sourdough feeding, but typically I like to do 2 to 2 to 1, which meaning I'm doing 2 parts flour, 2 parts water, 1 part starter. And that just, so that way, the reason you discard is that so you don't have to use as much flour in your recipe and you're not wasting as much flour. So for instance, I feed my sourdough starter for what I'm going to bake with, if that makes sense for the measurements. So I don't want to waste a bunch of flour in my sourdough starter if I'm just going to be throwing it away. So I will discard a lot of my sourdough in order to have a small sourdough starter so I don't have to feed as much flour. I'm hoping that makes sense. It might not. Someone maybe can explain it better in the comments. But you don't necessarily have to discard your sourdough, but you do need to make sure it's in the same ratio as feeding that you need. When your sourdough is kept at room temperature on your counter, you will need to feed it once every day. If it is in the fridge, you would typically can go about a week with feeding it. I would not put your sourdough starter that's new when you're starting out like this in the fridge until about 4 to 6 months. You want it to be really strong before you make it go dormant. I hope that this helped answer any questions that you had, or maybe gave you a little bit of motivation that sourdough is really not that complicated. It's pretty easy. and it's super fun and healthy to work with. So if you have any questions that I didn't get to, be sure to leave them below and I'd love to answer them. Thank you for watching today's video and be sure to subscribe for more content.